I played a silly game with my husband and he admitted he's always had feelings for my sister. Our whole family falls apart. 3 months later, he's begging me to come back but I have a surprise for him. I, 30 female, have been married to Dan, 32 male, for 5 years. We met in college when I was a sophomore and he was a senior. I was instantly drawn to his charismatic personality and infectious laugh. We became friends first, bonding over our shared love of obscure indie bands and terrible B-movies. It wasn't until after Dan graduated and moved back to our hometown that we started dating. My sister Trisha, 28 female, has always been a big part of our lives. She and I are incredibly close, we're only 2 years apart and have been best friends since childhood. When I started dating Dan, Trisha was thrilled. She said Dan was like the brother she never had. The three of us spent a lot of time together over the years, from weekend camping trips to holiday dinners with our families. Dan proposed after 3 years of dating. It was a magical moment. He took me back to the college campus where we met and got down on one knee in front of the library where we used to study together. Trisha was the first person I called with the news, and she cried tears of joy with me over the phone. Our wedding day was perfect. Trisha was my maid of honor, and she gave the most beautiful, heartfelt speech about our sisterhood and how happy she was to gain a brother in Dan. Looking back now, I remember thinking how lucky I was to have my sister and my husband be so close. If only I knew then what I know now. The first few years of our marriage were happy. Dan and I bought a small house in the suburbs and talked about starting a family soon. Trisha met her boyfriend Mark, 29M, about 2 years ago, and the four of us often double dated. Everything seemed perfect on the surface. Last month, Dan and I were having a quiet night in. It was a Friday, and we'd both had a long week at work. We opened a bottle of wine and started playing silly games to unwind. After a few glasses, I suggested we play the Celebrity Hall Pass game where you name 5 celebrities you'd be allowed to hook up with. I went first, naming my usual list of unattainable movie stars. Dan followed with 4 names of his own. But when it came to the 5th, he hesitated. I kept teasing him to finish his list, thinking he was just trying to come up with another name. That's when he blurted out, "Fine, I choose Trisha." The room went silent. I stared at Dan, waiting for him to laugh or say he was joking. But the look on his face told me he was dead serious. When I asked if he meant my sister Trisha, he nodded. I felt like I'd been doused in ice water. Dan tried to backpedal, saying it was just a game and didn't mean anything. But I could tell there was more to it. I pressed him to be honest with me. After what felt like hours of tense silence, Dan finally admitted that he's always found Trisha attractive. He said that back in college, before we started dating, he had considered asking her out. Apparently, he and Trisha had a class together one semester and really hit it off. Dan said he was working up the courage to ask her on a date when I came into the picture. I was stunned. All these years, I never knew my husband had initially been interested in my sister. I asked if he still had feelings for her, and his response shattered my heart. He said that while he loves me and is committed to our marriage, Trisha would always be his what-if person. He admitted that he sometimes wonders how things might have turned out if he'd pursued Trisha instead of me. The worst part was when Dan said he still finds Trisha more physically attractive than me. He tried to soften the blow by saying he chose me because of my personality and our connection, but that Trisha had always been more his type physically. I felt like my entire world was crumbling around me. Every memory I had of the three of us together suddenly took on a new, painful context. Had Dan been secretly pining for my sister all this time? How many times had he looked at her and wished she was his wife instead of me? I couldn't even look at Dan. I left the room and spent the night in our guest bedroom, crying myself to sleep. The next morning, Dan acted like nothing had happened. When I tried to talk about it, he told me I was overreacting. He said it's normal for people to be attracted to others, even family members, and that I should be flattered he chose me over Trisha in the end. His dismissive attitude made everything so much worse. This wasn't just some random attraction, this was my sister, someone who's been a huge part of our lives. I felt betrayed, humiliated, and completely lost. I didn't know what to do, so I reached out to my best friend Amy, 31F. Amy and I have been friends since high school, and she's always been my voice of reason. When I told her what happened, she was furious on my behalf. She said Dan's behavior was completely unacceptable and that I needed to tell Trisha. At first, I was hesitant to involve Trisha. I didn't want to cause drama or make things awkward between us. But the more I thought about it, the more I felt Trisha deserved to know. What if Dan had been harboring these feelings all along and had somehow acted on them? I needed to know if Trisha had any idea about Dan's attraction to her. So yesterday, I invited Trisha over for lunch while Dan was at work. Sitting across from her at our kitchen table, I struggled to find the words to explain what had happened. Trisha could tell something was wrong and kept asking if I was okay. Finally, I took a deep breath and told her everything Dan had said. Trisha's reaction was a mix of shock, disgust, and anger. She swore she had no idea Dan felt that way about her. She said she'd always seen him as a brother and was horrified to think he might have been viewing her differently all this time. Trisha was especially furious that Dan had compared us physically and said she was more his type. As we talked, Trisha suggested we confront Dan together. She said he needed to understand how inappropriate and hurtful his comments were. I was nervous about the idea, but I agreed it might be necessary. When Dan got home from work, we were both waiting for him in the living room. The look on his face when he saw us sitting there was a mixture of confusion and fear. Before he could say anything, Trisha launched into him. She told him how gross and disrespectful his comments were, both to me and to her. She said she was disgusted that he'd been harboring these feelings all this time and that he'd ruined the sibling-like relationship she thought they had. Dan tried to backpedal, claiming it was all a misunderstanding and that we were blowing things out of proportion. But neither Trisha nor I were having it. We both laid into him about how his words and actions had affected us. In the end, Dan stormed out of the house. He's been staying with a friend and has been blowing up my phone with angry messages. He says I betrayed his trust by telling Trisha and that I've ruined our marriage over nothing. He keeps insisting that his feelings for Trisha are harmless and that I'm being overly sensitive. Part of me wonders if I went too far by involving Trisha. I never wanted to cause a rift in our family. But I feel like Dan's the one who crossed a line here. I don't know how I can ever look at him the same way again knowing how he really feels about my sister. Every time I close my eyes, I see the three of us together, at our wedding, at family dinners, on vacation, and I wonder if Dan was wishing it was Trisha by his side instead of me. The thought makes me physically ill. I'm lost and confused. I love Dan, but I don't know if I can move past this. And now I feel like I've put Trisha in an impossible position too. She says she supports me no matter what, but I can tell she feels awkward and doesn't know how to act around Dan anymore. So Reddit, Ida for exposing my husband's secret feelings to my sister? Did I overreact by telling her, or was I right to let her know the truth? I'm torn between feeling justified in my actions and wondering if I've blown this whole situation out of proportion. Any advice would be appreciated because right now, I feel like my entire world is falling apart. Update 1. It's been 2 weeks since my last post, and I want to thank everyone for their support and advice. Reading your comments helped me realize I wasn't overreacting and gave me the strength to stand my ground. A lot has happened since then, and I'm still trying to process everything. Dan came home after a few days of staying with his friend. He tried to brush everything under the rug, saying he was drunk and didn't mean what he said. But I wasn't having it. I told him his comments revealed a deeper issue in our relationship and we needed to address it. We had a long, painful conversation where I got Dan to open up about his feelings. He admitted that he's always felt like he settled for me instead of pursuing Trisha. He said he loves me, but there's always been a part of him that wondered what if with Trisha. Hearing him say those words out loud broke my heart all over again. Dan tried to explain that his attraction to Trisha was purely physical and didn't mean anything. He said he chose me because we connected on a deeper level and that our relationship was more meaningful. But his words just made me feel worse. How could I ever feel secure in our marriage knowing he saw me as the consolation prize? I asked Dan if he wanted to try couples counseling, thinking maybe a professional could help us work through this. But he refused. He said therapy was for weak people and we should be able to work through our issues on our own. His response shocked me. I've always been an advocate for mental health, and his dismissive attitude towards therapy revealed yet another fundamental difference between us. I told Dan I needed some time and space to think about our future. He didn't take it well. He accused me of blowing things out of proportion and said I was being selfish for not just letting it go. His reaction only confirmed that he didn't truly understand how much he'd hurt me. While Dan and I were in this limbo, Trisha was dealing with her own fallout from the situation. She told me that her boyfriend Mark, 29M, was furious when he found out about Dan's comments. Apparently, Mark has always been a bit insecure about Trisha and Dan's close relationship. Learning about Dan's attraction to Trisha brought all those insecurities to the surface. Trisha and Mark had a huge fight about it. Mark accused Trisha of encouraging Dan's feelings somehow, even though Trisha had no idea about any of this until I told her. He questioned every interaction Trisha had ever had with Dan, twisting innocent moments into something sinister. Their relationship is on shaky ground now, and Trisha blames me for telling her and causing this rift with Mark. I feel terrible about the strain this has put on Trisha and Mark's relationship. I never meant to cause problems for them. I thought Trisha deserved to know the truth, but now I'm not so sure. Maybe ignorance really is bliss sometimes. The situation has also affected my relationship with Trisha. While she's been supportive, there's an undeniable awkwardness between us now. I catch her looking at me sometimes with pity in her eyes, and it makes me feel small. I hate that Dan's actions have tainted the close bond I've always had with my sister. As for my relationship with Dan, things have only gotten worse. He's been spending more and more time away from home, claiming he needs space too. But I found out from a mutual friend that he's been badmouthing me to anyone who will listen. He's painting himself as the victim, saying I'm blowing an innocent comment out of proportion and trying to turn everyone against him. His behavior has made me realize that the man I married isn't the person I thought he was. The Dan I fell in love with would never disrespect me like this or try to manipulate our friends against me. It's like his true colors are finally showing, and I don't like what I see. I've started to think seriously about separation. The trust between us is broken, and I'm not sure it can be repaired. But the thought of ending our marriage is terrifying. We've built a life together over the past 5 years. We have a house, shared finances, and all our friends are mutual. Starting over at 30 feels daunting. I've been going through old photos and mementos from our relationship, trying to pinpoint when things started to go wrong. Was Dan always harboring these feelings for Trisha, or did they develop over time? Were there signs I missed? The doubt and second guessing are eating me alive. For now, I'm taking it one day at a time. I'm focusing on my own mental health and leaning on my friends for support. Amy has been an absolute rock through all of this. She's let me crash at her place whenever things get too tense at home with Dan. I know I have some tough decisions ahead of me. But reading your comments has reminded me that I deserve better than a husband who sees me as second best to my own sister. Whatever happens, I'm determined to stand up for myself and my worth. The road ahead feels long and uncertain, but I'm trying to stay strong. Thank you all for your support and advice. I'll update again when I have more news. Update 2. It's been a month since my last update, and things have taken an unexpected turn. I've moved out of the house I shared with Dan and am staying with Amy for now. The final straw came when I discovered Dan had been messaging Trisha behind my back. I found out purely by accident. Trisha had left her phone at my place after a visit, and it kept buzzing with notifications. I wasn't trying to snoop, but I saw Dan's name pop up on her lock screen. Curious, I asked Trisha about it when she came to pick up her phone. Trisha looked uncomfortable and tried to brush it off at first. But when I pressed her, she broke down and showed me the messages. Dan had been reaching out to her, claiming he was worried about me and wanted to clear the air about what happened. But reading through their conversation, it was clear he was trying to manipulate Trisha into taking his side. He told Trisha that I had twisted his words and blown everything out of proportion. He tried to paint himself as the victim, saying I was punishing him for an innocent comment made while drunk. He even had the audacity to suggest that Trisha talk to me and convince me to forgive him. What hurt the most was seeing Dan tell Trisha that she was the only one who could understand him right now. He said they had a special connection that I could never understand. Reading those words made me feel like I was being stabbed in the heart all over again. I was furious. Not only was Dan trying to manipulate my sister, but he was also attempting to drive a wedge between us. It was a new low, even for him. Trisha was upset too. She felt like Dan was putting her in an impossible position and trying to exploit their friendship. When I confronted Dan about the messages, he exploded. He accused me of invading his privacy and turning Trisha against him. He said he had every right to talk to Trisha and that I was being controlling. The argument got heated, and Dan said some truly hurtful things. He told me I was lucky he'd chosen me over Trisha in the first place and that maybe he should have gone for her instead. That was the moment I knew our marriage was over. I couldn't stay with someone who could say such cruel things to me. I packed a bag and left that night. Dan has been alternating between angry messages demanding I come home and pleading texts saying he'll change. But I'm done. I've contacted a divorce lawyer and am starting the process of legally ending our marriage. The hardest part has been dealing with our friends and family. Some have been supportive, but others think I'm overreacting. Dan's family, in particular, have been giving me a hard time. They keep saying marriage is about forgiveness and that I'm throwing away years of happiness over one mistake. His mother even had the nerve to tell me that I should be flattered Dan finds my sister attractive because it means he has good taste in women. But I know in my heart that this isn't just about one drunken comment or a few inappropriate messages. It's about a fundamental lack of respect and a breach of trust that I don't think can be repaired. I deserve someone who sees me as their first choice, not a consolation prize. Trisha and I have grown closer through all of this. She's cut off all contact with Dan and has been incredibly supportive of my decision to leave. Her relationship with Mark is still rocky, but they're working through their issues. I feel guilty that my marital problems have affected their relationship, but Trisha assures me it's not my fault. As for me, I'm taking things one day at a time. Some days are harder than others. There are moments when I miss the life I had with Dan and wonder if I'm making a mistake. But then I remember how it felt to hear him say he settled for me, and I know I'm doing the right thing. I'm trying to focus on rebuilding my life now. I've thrown myself into my work and have started looking for my own apartment. It's scary to think about starting over, but it's also oddly exciting. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm putting myself first. There's still a long road ahead, especially with the divorce proceedings looming. But I'm determined to come out of this stronger. I deserve better, and I'm no longer afraid to demand it. Update 3. It's been 3 months since I left Dan, and I'm finally starting to feel like myself again. The divorce proceedings are underway, and while it's been stressful, I know it's the right decision. Dan hasn't made things easy. He's contested every part of the divorce, trying to claim that I'm at fault for the breakdown of our marriage. His lawyer even tried to argue that my overreaction to his comments about Trisha constituted emotional abuse. Thankfully, my lawyer shut that down quickly. The most surprising development has been the change in some of our mutual friends. People who initially sided with Dan have started to see through his act. A couple of our close friends, Jake and Lisa, reached out to me recently. They apologized for not believing me at first and said that Dan's behavior since our separation has opened their eyes to his true character. Apparently, Dan has been badmouthing me to anyone who will listen, twisting the story to make himself look like the victim. But his version of events keeps changing, and people are starting to notice the inconsistencies. He's also been drinking heavily and lashing out at friends who question his side of the story. One incident in particular seems to have turned the tide of public opinion. At a mutual friend's birthday party last week, Dan got drunk and started ranting about how Trisha was the one that got away. He said some pretty crude things about both Trisha and me, comparing us physically and lamenting that he chose wrong. Several of our friends were there and were horrified by his behavior. Word spread quickly, and now even some of Dan's staunchest supporters are distancing themselves from him. Trisha has been my rock through all of this. She stood by me despite Dan's attempts to turn her against me. She even testified on my behalf when we had to appear in court for a preliminary hearing. Seeing her stand up to Dan and defend me was a powerful moment. It reminded me that blood really is thicker than water. Trisha's relationship with Mark has improved too. After some couples counseling, Mark has realized that his insecurities about Dan were unfounded. He's apologized to Trisha for doubting her and has been making an effort to be more trusting. Seeing them work through their issues has given me hope that healthy relationships are possible. As for my personal life, I'm slowly starting to rebuild. I've found a small apartment of my own and am focusing on my career. I recently took on a big project at work that I'm excited about. It's nice to have something positive to focus on amidst all the divorce drama. I've even started dating again, although nothing serious yet. It feels good to be reminded that there are decent men out there who won't make me feel like a second choice. Last week, I went on a coffee date with a guy I met through a mutual friend. It was nothing earth-shattering, but it was nice to laugh and flirt without any pressure or expectations. Looking back, I can see now that there were red flags in my relationship with Dan that I ignored. His comments about Trisha weren't just a one-time drunken mistake, they were a symptom of deeper issues in how he viewed me and our marriage. I'm grateful that I found out the truth, even though it was painful. There are still tough days, of course. Sometimes I wake up and for a split second, I forget everything that's happened. Then reality comes crashing back and it hurts all over again. But those moments are becoming less frequent. I'm starting to look forward to the future instead of dwelling on the past. I'm not sure what the future holds, but I know I'm on the right path. I'm learning to trust myself again and to value my own worth. Whatever happens next, I know I'll face it with strength and dignity. To everyone who supported me through this journey, thank you. Your words of encouragement gave me strength when I needed it most. I'm not out of the woods yet, but I can see the light at the end of the tunnel. And for the first time in a long time, I'm excited to see where the path leads.